Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Monday, July the 7th, 2025. Today, Uranus moves into Gemini, and that is a big event. And in this video, I really want to go into detail about what it might mean for this sign change. And I'm going to be focusing sort of more on the collective global events, how it's going to impact society. And, already we're starting to see how Uranus in Gemini might be affecting us. But I think I'll be really going into it and looking at which countries might be particularly affected by Uranus's sign change. And of course, one country I'm really thinking about is the USA. But before I look at Uranus in Gemini, I want to consider the astrology and the I Ching for today, which is Monday, July the 7th, 2025. So here is the chart for today, set at noon, New York time. Don't forget to like and subscribe if appropriate. And you can see that the moon is in Sagittarius. So the moon sort of London time moved into Sagittarius sort of last night, late on Sunday. And so for most of us, it's a day in which we can feel this Sagittarian moon, and it makes a difference from moon in Scorpio, two very different signs, Scorpio and Sagittarius. Sagittarius has more movement. The moon is, of course, in a fire sign, and additionally, with moon in Sagittarius, it is in mutual reception with Jupiter, because moon is in a sign ruled by Jupiter, and Jupiter is in Cancer, which is ruled by the moon. So that is another reason why we should perhaps be quite happy that the moon is in Sagittarius. And I think that this is the first mutual reception, moon in Sagittarius, Jupiter in Cancer, that we've had for quite a long time. Probably for sort of 12 years or so, the last time Jupiter was in Cancer. So that could be quite fun, having the moon in this sign. And the moon, when it moves into Sagittarius, it does make a few aspects. It makes a trine to Saturn, makes a trine to Neptune, and it also makes a trine to Mercury. So you can see that there's a moon 9 degrees Sagittarius, at noon New York time. So there's Saturn and Neptune, makes a trine. Then the moon makes a trine to Mercury in Leo, and moon trine Mercury in Leo. That strikes me as being a good aspect. It facilitates communication. Communication can take place at many levels, and perhaps the mind and the heart can be at one with each other. Because moon is how we communicate, in terms of our feelings. Mercury is more about our brain, and so with moon trine Mercury, they come together sort of very, very well. And the final aspect we see today is, at least in terms of the moon, is the moon making a square to Mars. So, in fact, pretty much at the same time moon makes a trine to Mars, it also makes a square to Mercury. So Mercury, Mars, and the moon are sort of on the same wavelength. It's a sort of 12th harmonic wavelength, because trines and squares very much relating to the number 12. You can just see what I mean if I just show you the 12th harmonic chart for noon New York time. So from a 12th harmonic point of view, there is Mercury and Venus coming together in conjunction. Then the moon is starting to make a conjunction. That might seem a long way off, but don't forget this is a 12th harmonic, so things move 12 times faster on a 12th harmonic. But I'm not going to go into details of that here, but so that square is coming together. So there might be an element of choice here. Do we start to focus on Moon trine Mercury, or do we think about Moon square Mars? Now that could be a heated discussion as a trine and square sort of try to battle it out. Are we going to say something? Well, we're going to say something easily. The words come out, but then the question is, how do people respond? And so perhaps we need to be careful what we say. I mean, that can be a problem with Moon and Sagittarius. While I think that Moon and Sagittarius, it's great, particularly as it's in mutual reception with Jupiter, one thing about Moon and Sagittarius, it just can be rather blunt. And it's honest, completely honest, Moon and Sagittarius. Doesn't mean to offend. How can you offend if you tell the truth? But sometimes people can't handle the truth. And another aspect we have got is Venus trine Pluto. So Venus in, where's Venus gone? Venus in Gemini, trine Pluto. And that Venus trine Pluto, well, we've also got Venus conjunct Uranus. So you could say that Venus is bringing together Uranus and Pluto. But Venus trine Pluto may be about how we try to influence the world around us, or how the world around us tries to influence us. And some people can be quite influential. Now, it's not Venus trine Pluto, it's not in water signs, so we shouldn't exaggerate here. It's in air signs. So Venus trine Pluto is more about influence, through words, perhaps a manipulation of facts, and it is a time when we can exercise our power, but again, it's not really in a Scorpio way. Venus in Gemini, and so perhaps we can try to use our words to boost our influence. And then we've got the big event of the day, which is, of course, Uranus moving into Gemini. And Uranus moves into Gemini, I think, at 8:45 in the morning, London time. And this is a huge event. I'm not saying that we are necessarily going to see an immediate impact of Uranus in Gemini. Uranus, as I will be discussing later in this video, Uranus is a transpersonal planet. I mean, it's kind of sort of out there, and it's more about the collective than us sort of individuals down here on planet Earth. And so perhaps we shouldn't exaggerate its impact, at least in the short term. But Uranus in Gemini, we might notice a change, especially if we're sensitive, and we'll see that the pace of things will increase. Uranus has moved into a negative sign, an earth sign, into a positive, an air sign. And so that does make things more exciting. But I don't want to talk too much about Uranus and Gemini here. So later in the video, I'll be going into details. And then, that's a picture in, it's set for New York. If we set that chart for Sydney, Australia, okay, at noon, the moon is at sort of 1 degree 57 Sagittarius. So perhaps in the morning, the moon will be in Scorpio. That's especially the case if you're in New Zealand. So first part of the day, moon in Scorpio, and with moon in Scorpio, if you are in Australasia and you're doing stuff in the morning, you might feel that not a great deal is going on. The day might start off as being quite flat. But don't worry. Things speed up, and sort of by lunchtime, early afternoon, things should be moving. And then there is the heliocentric view, putting the sun at the center of the solar system. And so this chart is potentially dramatic. We have a sesquiquadrate between Mars and Uranus. So Mars, Uranus, they're 135 degrees apart. And so that does indicate some kind of tension. Whenever you see Mars, Uranus, you get that. I mean, of course, the Earth is still making a square to Mars. It's really separating now, but now we've got Mars semi-sextil-quadrate Uranus, yeah, exactly there, and also Mercury is making would have made a semi-square to Mars, and then it will be making an opposition to Uranus. So this Mercury, Mars, Uranus configuration could potentially stir things up, and we might find that things could be tense, and it's quite a combative combination. Mars sextil-quadrate Uranus, and perhaps with Mercury opposition Uranus, that might also be reflected in what people say. So those are a few thoughts on the heliocentric view, and it's now time to look at today from the viewpoint of the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for today, which is Monday, July the 7th, 2025. Aries. Aries, things are happening. The moon is out of Scorpio, it's in Sagittarius, and with the moon in Sagittarius, making a mutual reception with Jupiter, so it's a strong Jupiter, and it's with it's a strong moon by virtue of its mutual reception with Jupiter. And from an Aries view, the moon is in a fire sign, and it's how you want it to be. Aries is an honest sign. Moon in Sagittarius is also an honest placement, and so perhaps Aries, it is a time when you can tell people what's on your mind. You've got a lot on your mind, and you don't want anything to be hidden. Things have been hidden for long enough, and enough is enough, and it's now time to be open and honest. And if you want to be open and honest, I really think that you can be, and you're helped by the moon making a trine to Mercury. Moon in Sagittarius making a trine to Leo, fire signs. So that really gives you a lift, and so you can really be yourself. Now, in the process, some people might not be happy. You might say things which cause dismay. Because the moon makes a trine to Mercury, but it also makes a square to Mars, and there is a question of how do you deal with it. Now, one approach, Aries, is to perhaps focus on the moon trine Mercury. Moon trine Mercury, nice, easy, fluent communication. Don't be too controversial. That's one approach. But inevitably, that moon square Mars might make itself felt. And in spite of your efforts to keep things easy, to keep things light, there just may be something, maybe some detail that you just can't get out of your head, and you want to talk about it. You perhaps shouldn't talk about it, but as soon as you start being open and honest, you might get a negative response. But it's time to just keep going. Just because someone is upset doesn't mean you have to be upset. And Aries, can be like a fire moving through grass. It just moves quickly, and just Aries doesn't dwell on things. At least when Aries is on good form, it doesn't dwell on things. So there is a dispute with someone, but it lasts a few seconds and you move on. There can be an argument within a wider conversation, and we disagree on this point, and then we just move on, and that's kind of how it should be. And Aries, it's very important that you don't limit yourself, and you should be looking for opportunities, and maybe it's also about taking something that really is quite exciting and you sort of bringing it down to earth and making it real, making it a permanent part of your life. And that reminds us that Saturn is in Aries. Obviously Saturn's been in Aries, your sign, for some time. It does go retrograde next weekend, so it won't be in Aries forever. I mean, it does briefly go back into Pisces, but right now it is in Aries and it's not retrograde, and the moon is making a trine to Saturn. And so that might be Aries, an opportunity to take something which is far-fetched, which is rather intangible, and to take it and to make it real. And you make it real through addressing it and then taking action on its behalf. And so with that action, you can really make a lasting impact. Now, as far as close relationships are concerned, it's probably not a good idea to spend too much time with just one person. The moon is making an opposition to Venus, and just spending time with one person could be asking for trouble. It just becomes too much of a good thing. And so maybe, Aries, you should be thinking about the group. What is going on with other people. And you want to have freedom. You want to be able to move from one person to another person, from place to place. You don't want to be restricted, and that is especially the case now that Uranus is in Gemini. And with Uranus in Gemini, this is not just a one-day wonder. Uranus is going to stay in Gemini on and off until 2032. And so with Uranus in Gemini, it is a long-term trend. I mean, it's not necessarily anything you're going to feel today, but it perhaps reminds you that you need your freedom, and there are many ways of communicating. There are many ways of expressing, who you are and what you want, and there are also many ways of traveling. And so, with Uranus in Gemini, this does remind you of all of the possibilities. And if you're a driver, then Uranus in Gemini may say something about your relationship to your car. Again, not today, but perhaps over the next sort of 7 years or so, your relationship to your car and how you drive, where you drive to, that might change. But it's not just about cars, it's about transport, and whether you travel by bus or by foot, however you're used to traveling, you perhaps need to see that in a new way. I'm not trying to frighten you, by the way. I'm just saying that this could represent exciting possibilities, or certainly interesting possibilities. So do think about travel, and of course, also, remembering that Uranus stays in Gemini for 7 years. Think about where you're living. Think about who is living next to you, who is living above you, below you. Because with Uranus in Gemini, things might change. And, if, for example, your neighbor sells their house and someone else comes in, that could create change for better or for worse. And so, do be aware of your neighbors and what they're doing. And, again, not just now, over the next few years. And so if, for example, you are moving into a new house or a new apartment, it doesn't matter whether you're buying or you're renting. I suppose the problem with buying is it's a more of a commitment. Always think about who you're going to be living next to. It really does matter. So that's one way in which Uranus in Gemini is going to work. But I'll be returning to this theme over the next few months. And of course, Uranus does leave Gemini temporarily, and it doesn't actually then when does it leave? It leaves Gemini in November, then it doesn't come back until April of next year. So I'll be talking quite a lot over the next few months about Uranus in Gemini. Taurus, there is a mutual reception between the Moon and Jupiter. Moon and Jupiter are in each other's signs, and this mutual reception could be quite powerful. It could be quite intense, and in a good way. And it does allow you to really understand things. Because that's what matters. And in order to understand things, of course, you do need to have a degree of flexibility. That matters. You can't just be focused on yourself and your experiences of the past, because things have changed, things are in the process of changing. And so by understanding those dynamics, then you are making things easier for yourself. And yes, you're creating the possibility of being able to sort of move on, sort of intellectually and perhaps emotionally as well. And one movement we have, today, Uranus is in Gemini, moves into Gemini. And of course, what that means is that Uranus has moved out of Taurus. Uranus has moved out of your sign. And okay, it does go back into Taurus at the end of the year, I think from November to early November through to the end of April of next year. Uranus will be returning to Taurus. But now that Uranus is moving out of Taurus, you may find yourself perhaps being more reasonable. Uranus is a fixed sign. Uranus in Taurus, it's a fixed sign, and some things you've really held on to, and you can only hold on to something for so long. And with Uranus moving into Gemini, maybe just something has to be let go of. And of course, once you let go of something, you can give yourself a chance to really understand what is going on. Because if you're holding on to a concept or an idea too tightly, it just does limit you, and that's not what we want to happen with Taurians. Taurians do need to have some movement. That really does matter. And one movement that we had pretty recently, it's not just Uranus moving into Gemini, we have had Venus moving into Gemini. That's been happening over the last couple of days. And Venus in Gemini is now making a trine to Pluto, and this Venus trine Pluto, I would regard as working in your favor. Of course, it depends what you're doing, but if you are in a position where you want to be noticed, where you want to have an influence, then I think the Venus trine Pluto is going to help. And that might be particularly noticeable if you're working or doing anything to do with finance. You have ideas about money and how money should be used, how resources should be used. And there might be an inspiration, Venus trine Pluto. You might start to see something and you realize what is important. And perhaps in the past you hadn't taken something seriously. You regarded it as being fairly trivial, but now you're seeing it in a new way. And with Venus trine Pluto, you can see the possibility of real transformation here. And so you don't just sit on it. Sometimes Taurians can do that. They can just hold on to something, they don't want to let go of it, and it just festers, and they get annoyed with themselves and they get annoyed with other people, but they can't express their annoyance. But now that Venus is trine Pluto, it changes, and Venus is in Gemini, and so it's okay to speak. It's okay to express your views. It's Venus is conjunct Uranus as well. Okay, the Venus conjunct Uranus may not be exact, but it's good enough. It's making its impact felt, and so if you want people to just stop and listen, Taurus, then that's very much something you can do. And as far as other people are concerned in relationships, Taurians need to be quite objective at the moment. It's all very well and good having attachments, but today you don't want to get too hung up on attachments. Having objectivity, not regarding any one person as being especially important, because if you regard one person as being especially important, that means you're regarding other people as being less important. So perhaps you can spread your care and affection widely. Perhaps just think of humanity at large. And so it would perhaps be a shame if you were to spend too much time with another person, because then you might be missing out and other people might be missing out. And just don't take anything too seriously. On an emotional level. It is a time, Taurus, actually, when you are quite emotional, when your emotions are powerful with the moon in Sagittarius. But keep those emotions moving and don't allow them to fixate on any one person. Gemini, Uranus is in your sign, and on and off Uranus will stay in your sign until 2032. I mean, that is that's kind of quite frightening. At least it is for me. I'm 63 now, so when Uranus moves into Cancer in August 2032, I'm going to be 70. So that's really quite a thought. The Geminis, at least this Gemini, doesn't like the idea of getting old, and very aware of the passing of time, and just thinking about that chunk of time that is about to pass. And before I know it, I'll be 70, and that is quite an overwhelming thought. But anyway, I don't want to dump those thoughts onto you. The point is, Uranus is moving into your sign, and I think that's good news. Probably Gemini is a sign where Uranus works pretty well. I mean, it's about change. Geminis like change. Geminis do get bored, and so having Uranus moving into your sign, it just stirs things up, and it perhaps reminds you that you can be a rebel. Uranus certainly has a rebellious streak, and if there are things you want to do, and now's the time to do it. And if you want to change the world, if there's any chance of you changing the world, then Uranus moving into Gemini, well, get it together. And so think about what can you achieve between now and 2032. Of course, I'm thinking about that myself. This Gemini, I always have fantasies about changing the world. I mean, they're fantasies by and large, but this is my last chance. And so, Gemini, do think about how you are different, and don't just sit on it, because time is passing. And so, think about what you can accomplish. And at the moment, we've got Venus moving. You've got Venus moving through your sign, and so there is a Venus conjunct Uranus, and Venus is making a trine to Pluto. So Gemini, don't underestimate yourself. It really is a time when you can make things happen. A time in the short term, while Venus is in Gemini, while the moon is. Not the moon, I mean, while Venus is close to Uranus, so in the short term, but also in the longer term. So perhaps you should think about what you actually want to have achieved by August of 2032. I mean, it might seem a long time, that's, over 7 years, but time flies. It really does. And so that's Uranus in Gemini, and there's a lot more to be said about this. Now, the moon is in Sagittarius. It is in your opposite sign, and so with the moon in Sagittarius, you might find that you have to put things in terms of other people, and you might feel that it's important to be aware of them, but you need to have a sense of proportion. If you spend too much time worrying about other people and what they're doing and what they want, it could be very sort of unsatisfying. And probably Gemini, if you make a special effort to get on with people and to sort of perhaps interest them in what you're doing, you might actually be disappointed. I think that socially, you might feel blocked. It's not your problem. It's someone else's problem, maybe. But people are not feeling very sociable, and however sociable you feel, you just may not feel that your efforts are reciprocated. So with Moon and Sagittarius, by all means, try to understand people, try to respond to them, but don't necessarily think that you're going to achieve amazing things, and you should be satisfied with small gains. Being able to say something, moon trine Mercury, moon trine Mercury does facilitate conversation, but it's a kind of conversation that just may not in the short term go anywhere. It might feel as if it's going somewhere, but when you're actually looking for a commitment from another person, well, yeah, that might be hard to find. And also, the moon is making a square to Mars, and so with moon square Mars, you have your own limits. You try to be friendly and open-minded, but still there's something there that you're holding on to and that you don't want to let go of. And if anyone crosses those limits, you might get annoyed or upset. Even if you're not annoyed, something can just manifest sort of almost at an unconscious level. And also, when we looked at the heliocentric chart, Mercury was making an opposition to Uranus, and so that Mercury opposition Uranus, too much conversation, too much talking could, in certain cases, have a negative impact. Something might just happen, and it might be you. Geminis, have a reputation for being sort of easygoing and being able to sort of not get too upset about any one thing. But you're capable of getting upset. You're capable of coming across things that annoy you, and so maybe Gemini, you should say as much as you can, but don't overdo it. And also be thinking about the next 7 years. How are you going to create a huge change? It can be done, but of course it's not necessarily going to be easy, particularly if you want to be or have fantasies of being some kind of global player. Cancer. Cancer, I think that today you are in a good position, and one reason you're in a good position is because the moon is making a mutual reception to Jupiter. Moon in Sagittarius making a mutual reception to Jupiter in Cancer. Of course, Jupiter in Cancer moving through your sign, and this is the first mutual reception between Moon in Gemini Moon in Sagittarius and Jupiter in Cancer since Jupiter has moved into your sign. And so this does allow you to really get things together. And I think that over the course of the day you're going to be pretty organized. You can get things together, and if you have an idea about the way you'd like things to be, then I think that your organizing vision can really be obvious, and things will just go your way. And so if something needs to change, Cancer, then it can change, and you can come up with good reasons why it should change. So if you're trying to get other people to do things your way and to organize things your way, then I think that this is something you very much can do. You will have good reasons, and people are going to just listen to you and accept that you really know what you're doing. And this also applies to money. The moon is making a trine to Saturn. It's making a trine to Mercury, and Mercury's in Leo at the moment. And it's a good time to be thinking about money, to be communicating your ideas about money. And if you think that something needs to be changed, then Cancer, go for it. You generally have a good understanding of financial realities, which I think today you're going to be very good at expressing. Now, one thing that has happened, or is happening, is that Uranus is moving into Gemini. And this is a changeover that does actually last until 2032. That's when Uranus moves into Cancer. So that's something to look forward to. 2032, Uranus moving into your sign. I mean, it might seem a long time, 7 years, but 7 years can fly, particularly if you're enjoying yourself. And so, with Uranus in Gemini, you have to remember that this is very collective. It may not affect your day-to-day life, and so you could say, well, Uranus in Gemini is something quite introspective in a Cancerian chart. Gemini is a sign before Cancer, and so your ideas for rebellion, for doing things differently, you might want to keep things to yourself. Now, 7 years is a long time to keep things to yourself, and I'm not saying that is what you should do. And there may be other ways of looking at Uranus in Gemini. You can be a rebel, but you can be almost a rebel who isn't seen or heard. You make the changes in a very subtle way. And so if you're not happy with the world in which you're living and you feel it could be better, maybe there are things you can do behind the scenes. And so that is a possible source of action. You don't have to be in the spotlight to create huge changes, and that kind of suits the Cancerian approach often very well. And so that might be something you want to think about with Uranus moving into Gemini, though it's going to affect some signs more than others, and I just don't think that for you Uranus in Gemini is necessarily such a major thing. Now, Uranus in Cancer, which as I said, it does happen, I think August the 3rd, 2032, when Uranus moves into your sign. That perhaps is something you need to prepare for. And then, of course, you have the whole sort of 7-year cycle, because Uranus does spend about 7 years in each sign. And if we take a broader perspective, actually there's nothing wrong with looking at 7 years. Where am I going to be in 7 years? What am I going to be doing in 7 years? And so perhaps there's something you need to work on over the next 7 years. And I know it sounds difficult having to work on something for 7 years. That is a long time. But sometimes you just need to get that kind of perspective. So that's a very broad thing to do, and as far as the specifics of today are concerned, I'm not convinced you're going to be feeling Uranus in Gemini. I think it's going to be more about what you're trying to get together, and I think that you're going to be an effective communicator. You will know how to look after yourself, and if you don't like something, you will be able to tell people you don't like it. And there is a question of how you tell them. In most cases, it's just enough to say what's on your mind, and the words will flow, you'll get feedback, and things will be resolved. But the moon does make a square to Mars, and the moon making a square to Mars, that might be about a disagreement, something you're not happy about. Maybe some detail you're not happy about and you need to tell someone about it. So the question then is it worth it? Maybe you're exaggerating. Something may not be perfect, but just because something is not perfect doesn't necessarily mean that you have to complain about it. Leo, we've got a lot of fire at the moment. We've got the fire that matters. We've got the moon in Sagittarius, and the moon in Sagittarius is making a trine to Mercury in Leo, and so that really does really help to move things. And Leo, you're going to be able to express yourself extremely well, and also you can demonstrate a lightness of touch, and you will have you will have a sense of humor, and people will enjoy what you say, and they might be sort of amused by what you say, and additionally, you'll be able to initiate things. You are quite active at the moment, and you're mentally active, and so if you've got ideas, then you can bring them out and talk about them, but don't be too precious about these ideas. Mercury and Leo can be tempted to believe that your ideas are the best ideas and they don't have to be changed. Well, maybe they need to be changed a bit. You do have a certain amount of flexibility. I think that is important. But provided you're relatively easygoing, then I think that everyone's going to pick up on this, and you're going to get a positive response. And it's the beginning of a new week, and you're ready to look at things in a different way. And the moon it's out of Scorpio. It's in Sagittarius. While the moon was in Scorpio, you might have felt somewhat sort of introspective. You weren't quite your normal self. But now that the moon is in Sagittarius, you're ready, and you're ready for the new week. And you just come over as being a person who is quite impressive, and people don't want to take things too seriously. And you might be just the person to lighten everything up. And we do have an important sign change today, and that is Uranus moving out of Taurus. So Uranus has moved out of an angular sign. So Uranus is a high profile sign in your chart, and Uranus has been there. It's been in this sign for 7 years, and now it's out. And with Uranus moving into Gemini, the first thing you need to do is maybe reflect on the last 7 years. What has happened? How have you changed in terms of how you are presenting yourself, and have your ambitions been achieved? So if you think about the kind of ambitions you had 7 years ago, to what extent have you been successful? And that might be something to think about. Have you created the changes you wanted to make? Now, if you haven't made those changes, well, don't worry. Uranus does move back into Taurus in the end, from sort of November the 7th to the 8th of this year through to August 25th, 26th of next year. Uranus will be back in Taurus. So if you feel that there's unfinished business, Leo, then it's not too late, and it may be at the end of the year you can revisit the issue and sort things out, and perhaps you have to be brave and force through some kind of change. But now that Uranus is moving in Gemini, these next few months, while Uranus in Gemini, there may be other things you need to think about. You might want to think about what it is you really hope for. What are your real hopes? And hopes are not the same as ambitions. It's what are your hopes for the future? And when you actually think about your hopes for the future, not just today, but over the next few months, you might realize that actually something has shifted. It's not how it used to be, and you have changed, you have matured, and perhaps you now have a more spiritual view. Even if it's not spiritual, you have a perspective. It's not just about you and your personal ambitions. It's about something broader than that, which has a sort of an element of idealism. And with Uranus and Gemini, you're maybe starting to pick up on that, and that might be something you want to work on, over the next few months. But as far as today is concerned, you seem to be in a fairly friendly state of mind. If you make an effort to get on with people, I think you can. But don't forget about your own core individuality, and what amuses you, what you find satisfying. And if you concentrate on that with Moon trine Mercury, then I think that it's a day when things should work pretty well for you. Virgo, Uranus is moving into Gemini, and Uranus stays in Gemini and on and off until 2032. Okay, it does move. It does move back into Taurus between November and April of next year, but that's only temporary. The main thing is that, the sign change has happened, and so perhaps you need to think about you and what you want to do in the next 7 years. And of course, it depends on where you are and what your priorities are, and perhaps where you are in life. But if we look at Uranus in Gemini in isolation, from a Virgo perspective, one might say that this is a time when Virgos perhaps should be thinking about their ambitions. What would you like to do, and to what extent are you going to be limiting yourself? We always need some kind of limitation. You can't do everything, but Uranus is quite a revolutionary force. It's about turning things upside down. It's not about just sticking to what you know and trust. And Virgos can sometimes like to know what's going on. They don't want too much change. And Uranus has just come out of Taurus, and so with Uranus in Taurus, and perhaps we have to think about the contrast between Uranus in Taurus and Uranus in Gemini. And perhaps with Uranus in Taurus, there were things you kind of worked through, you wanted to work through, and you felt that your ideas were changing. But just because ideas change doesn't necessarily mean that there is action. I don't think that's the case. In many cases, you can just keep it to yourself. But now that Uranus is in Gemini, perhaps you want to take some of your realizations of the last few years and make them real. And you might start to realize that things aren't good enough as far as where you're moving with your ambitions. Might say something about your job if you have a job. Now that Uranus is moving into Gemini, you're going to want a lot more from that job. And if that job isn't giving you what you want, you might want to move on. Or you might want to do something that allows you to be sort of more independent, and not to have to do things other people's way all the time. Because that is the nature of Uranus moving through Gemini. Now there is a question of whether or not you need to worry about it. Now you could say that Uranus in Gemini is a fairly collective force. Uranus is a discovered planet. I mean, before 1781, when Uranus was discovered, well, there was no Uranus, and people didn't have to worry about Uranus. But now it's there. But if you want to ignore Uranus, perhaps you can. And if you find it impossible to ignore Uranus, then it's not necessarily entirely personal. It is a collective planet. So if you feel the need for change, then you're just picking up on what everyone else is picking up on. Now, as far as specifics, it could be Uranus moving through Gemini. It does depend on your situation, but technology could be important. Uranus is a planet of technology, and so if you are working, you have to be ready to deal with new technology. I mean, I know that's an obvious point. People always say that. I mean, it doesn't matter what your sign is. You've always got to take into account new technology, but it may be very specific to you. And maybe you will have a capacity to deal with technology which might actually seem quite frightening at the moment, but perhaps you can actually deal with this technology in a very sort of unique Virgoan kind of way. And so I would regard Uranus and Gemini as being a positive, and it's just important that you're aware of it. The danger might be that if you ignore Uranus in Gemini, you could ignore Uranus in Gemini, but if you were to ignore Uranus and Gemini, it might just creep up behind you. It might make you the sort of passive recipient of its disruption. And so perhaps when we talk about disruption, Virgo, perhaps you should be the disruptor, because by being the disruptor, you're the active player. If you're not the disruptor, then something else might disrupt you. And so that might say something about how you should deal with Uranus in Gemini, not just now, but, over the next 7 years, because it's Uranus does stay in Gemini on and off until I think August the 3rd, 2032. So that is an important event, and on a sort of a more short-term, sort of down-to-earth level, as far as what is happening today, Monday, then you have perhaps these big ideas in the background, but as far as what you actually want to do today, and perhaps tomorrow as well, probably Virgo, you just want to just be left alone. I think that you'll quite enjoy your own company, and if you are on your own, I think that you can make some interesting discoveries that you don't have to talk about. The moon is making a trine to Mercury. It's quite a gentle trine to Mercury, and you don't want to be putting yourself in a position where you've got any form of conflict. The moon does make a square to Mars. Now, moon square Mars might be about something annoying you, someone getting in your way, trying to disrupt you, trying to insist on your attention. But if you can just steer clear of aggravation and just work on something, think about something, something that you enjoy, something you feel comfortable with. So overall, don't feel that there needs to be too much pressure. But at the same time, do remember Uranus has moved into Gemini, and I do think that really is for you an important event. Libra. There's no reason why it can't be a sort of fairly easy, straightforward day. You should find that things are working quite well, and you are working quite well, and you can be yourself. You don't have to hide anything, and you're going to be helped by a trine between the moon and Mercury. This moon Mercury trine, it's a very easygoing trine, and if you want to do something, you can just do it. And you should find that most people are just pretty responsive to you and your charms, and if you want to talk about something, you can, but there doesn't have to be any pressure. And by and large, you can do things at your own pace, and at the same time, there will be some excitement in the air. Moon is in Sagittarius, a fire sign. Mercury is in Leo, a fire sign. So that moon trine Mercury does create some action, and you can create some action. By the things you say, by the things you suggest, and also, other people should be, quite responsive, and they themselves are going to come up with good ideas, interesting ideas. So that just might be, how the day works out. And, it's important, not to take any one person too seriously. You can be everyone's friend if you want. You're there for other people. They're there for you, but you don't have to spend any time just on any, or too much time worrying about any one person, and you can just get a broader perspective. People have their role in your life, but you don't have to worry excessively about it. Now, the big event today is Uranus moving into Gemini. Now, you may not feel Uranus moving into Gemini right now. It is a sort of a longer term event. Uranus does stay in Gemini, on and off until 2032, so the next sort of 7 years. Although at the end of the year it does briefly go back into Taurus. And Uranus in Gemini at the moment, Venus is actually conjunct Uranus. So we've got Venus conjunct Uranus in Gemini. So that might be something you feel in the shorter term. It is exciting, and you might actually feel some excitement if you're sensitive. If you're the kind of Libra that is sensitive to collective forces, then yeah, maybe you'll tell yourself that something really has changed, and that might be reflected in your dreams or your ideas. You might start having new ideas which do seem exciting, and they point to a future that okay, it might be not a particularly stable future, but certainly an interesting future, and something you might even be looking forward to. But looking at Uranus in Gemini, on its own, and how it is going to affect you, it should elevate you. It should allow you to see a sort of a new perspective, and maybe you'll start to realize that in the past you'd been sort of too short term. You'd focused on things which weren't actually very important. I mean, they might have felt important at the time, but now you're getting a perspective, and you start to see that you need to have a wider approach. And over the next 7 years, Libra, it's a time for really sort of elevating yourself in terms of your ideas, and moving beyond yourself and your own interests, and seeing yourself as part of a wider whole. And so this might relate to your ideas about society and your role in society. What things do you have to do? You can't just be an observer, but it also might say something about your spirituality. And spirituality can be a complex thing, particularly when Uranus is in Gemini. And with Uranus in Gemini, there's always contrast and there's always contradiction. That's part of what Gemini is about. And you might sort of distinguish between what is genuinely worth following in a sort of spiritual sense and what is fairly mundane. Or it just could be the distinction between the sacred and the profane with Uranus moving into Gemini. There are things that, you are interested in, but they're of no lasting value. But there are other things that are absolutely crucial and core to who you are. And so that might be your challenge as Uranus moves through Gemini. And you should be thinking about, where do you want to be in 2032? And so in 2032, you probably want a broader perspective, to be thinking about things in a new way, and also to feel that you really are genuinely part of something and that you are plugged into the collective. And maybe that's what you should really aim for. Scorpio, Uranus moving into Gemini. I mean, that's something I have been talking about for every sign, and I can't ignore that. It's going to affect all of us, regardless of our sign. It may not affect us in a huge and personal way, but it's something that we just do have to be aware of. And with Uranus moving into Gemini, it may strangely sort of emphasize your Scorpio nature. Now, that might not seem very obvious. Gemini and Scorpio are two signs that are very, very different from one another. But with Uranus and Gemini, you might have revelations, sort of emotional revelations, but the kind of emotional revelation that you can verbalize. And so over the next few years, you may be able to start to sort of verbalize your feelings in a way you haven't been able to do before. And you'll perhaps be able to sort of tune into some kind of sort of collective change that you are part of, because it's not just you that has emotions. The collective has emotions, and the collective is often not very aware of its own emotions. But you, Scorpio, you kind of know what's going on, and you can perhaps communicate on behalf of the group to yourself in the first instance. Maybe you can communicate to a wider audience as well, but you will kind of know what's going on, and that can be the great thing about Uranus. Uranus brings things to light, and when you're in Gemini, it can actually verbalize them as well. Now, you don't necessarily have to worry about Uranus in Gemini. It's not necessarily going to dominate your life. Very often we look at Uranus moving through the signs, and we wonder, well, did that really work? Did that really manifest? Maybe it didn't, but it's just something for you to think about. Now, as far as today is concerned, Scorpio, there is a trine between the Moon and Mercury, and this trine is useful, and it may actually be quite sort of practical and down to earth. And so if you want things, if you feel that things have to be sorted out and you want to make an impression, then you can make an impression. If you're going into work, then if you have a job, then I think that Moon trine Mercury is going to be very useful. You're going to be able to explain yourself very well, and if there's anyone you need to talk to of a conversation of sort of a financial or business nature, I think that you should be able to make the connection, and I think that you'll be able to communicate your ideas and concerns very well. And if you're a Scorpio looking for a job, then this Moon trine Mercury really, to my mind, looks very helpful. Of course, no promises, but I think you will know who to send letters to, who to send emails to. Maybe people will be more responsive to you than usual. So do try to use that Moon trine Mercury. Whatever you're doing, it's not just about business and jobs and work. It just could be about just explaining yourself, saying, what's on your mind. Now, not everyone is going to like what you say. I mean, the Moon is making a square to Mars as well as a trine to Mercury. And it could be that you might say too much. Moon trine Mercury is a very smooth talking aspect, but the words flow, and at a certain point, someone might say something, or you might be saying something which gets a negative reaction. But if there is a negative reaction, you find yourself in a situation of where there's disagreement, then it may just be a question of you keep talking, and then you can move on. Or maybe you don't want to move on. Maybe you feel that now is a time to really bring something out into the open. And whatever happens though, Scorpio, I do think that your basic ability to handle people today is actually going to be very good. And so even if you disagree with someone or they disagree with you, I think you're going to be able to sort of get around the problem, and in the end, maybe everyone can be friends. Well, maybe it's not quite as good as that, but there's no need for people to fall out. And it's also just important, Scorpio, that you're able to say what's on your mind, because you have got a lot to say, and most of what you say is going to be very useful. Sagittarius, things are looking good. Moon is in your sign, and the Moon is making a mutual reception to Jupiter. Jupiter is of course your ruler. So with that mutual reception, Sagittarius, I am confident that it can be a day where things go your way, and when there shouldn't be much resistance. So if there's something you want to do, then feel free, go for it. It will be, I think, easier than expected, and probably in most cases you're going to be able to be open and honest. and that's important for a Sagittarius. Sagittarius is an honest sign, and you do want to be able to say whatever you like, and you don't want resistance, and I don't think you'll get much in the way of resistance. And some people might be concerned by what you say, but I think they'll understand, and there'll be just something about your honesty that's sort of almost disarming. Though the moon doesn't just make a trine to Mercury, it does make a square to Mars, and that square between the moon and Mars does have a hard edge to it. You have definite things that you want to achieve today, and you don't really want to be stopped. And so if you're able to decide what those things are, and you're able to isolate them, say you want to achieve A, B, and C, then Sagittarius, I think there's every chance that you will be successful, and people will get out of your way, and they will certainly listen to you because you've got lots to say, and whatever your arguments are, I think that your arguments are going to be really very convincing. Now, one thing that is happening today is that Uranus is moving into Gemini, and Gemini is your opposite sign, and Gemini in the Sagittarius chart is of course a sign that has a lot to do with relationships. And with Uranus moving into Gemini, remember it stays there for a long time, on and off. Uranus will be in Gemini until August the 3rd, 2032. Now it does temporarily leave Gemini in November, and from November of this year until sort of April of next year, but that's just a few months. By and large, there is 7 years of Uranus in your opposite sign, and that might indeed say something about relationships. And so, for example, if you are coming into these 12-sign readings from a solar view, this is, if you're a Sagittarius sun sign, that would mean that you're going to have Uranus opposition your sun, and that Uranus opposition of sun may stir you up. It may stir up another person. So that's one way of looking at it. Now, if you're coming into this chart from a viewpoint of your ascendant, it's slightly different, but we can say that from a whole sign perspective, Uranus will be in your 7th house. Uranus will be in the house of relationships. And so other people may change, and of course you may change, but other people's behavior may become more erratic, not what you expected. Maybe you got into a relationship with a set of assumptions, and now your assumptions may be challenged. And I'm not just talking about romantic relationships, or maybe someone you're married to. It could be any kind of relationship. It could be a business partnership. You've made assumptions, and now you see someone's behavior for what it really is. And then you also have to ask yourself, are you projecting? So if you see someone's behavior as being unusual, not what you were expecting, is that another person's problem, or perhaps you are attracting something, or you're attracting certain interpretations. So you yourself might be looking for change, and so as a result you might project that change onto another person, and you interpret their behavior as just showing that something is changing, and you perhaps don't want to take full responsibility for your own need for change. And so you have certain ideas, and it could be about independence. And again, whose independence is it? You're going to value your independence, but with Uranus moving into Gemini, it may be that someone else is valuing their independence. So ask yourself, are you doing anything to restrict another person's independence? I mean, that certainly is a possibility. And Additionally, Uranus moving into Gemini, it has an exciting feel to it, and it may just be about new people coming into your life, new and exciting people coming into your life. In the past, things might have been a little boring and a little bit too routine and humdrum. With Uranus and moving into Gemini, things are happening, and maybe someone who seemed boring is actually a lot more interesting than you'd realized. So that could be a manifestation of Uranus moving into Gemini. But perhaps a broad message with Uranus moving into Gemini is don't make assumptions about other people. Other people have their unique personalities, and don't think that you know what they're going to do next, because people can do strange things, and that might be a good thing, it might be a bad thing, but other people's uniqueness is real, and it can have an impact. Capricorn, over the next couple of days, you may be of a view that you want to take stock of things. Things have been happening, and you're trying to work out what it all means. Some of it is not entirely easy to understand, and so it just might be a good time to step back and review whatever's been going on over the last couple of days, and perhaps to get your strength back, because some Capricorns may feel exhausted, not completely exhausted, but probably you feel that you would like more energy than you actually have, and so maybe you need to catch up on sleep. Make sure that you're properly rested. That would be a good way of dealing with today. Okay, it's supposed to be a new week, but certainly in the United States there's been the Independence Day weekend, and maybe it feeds into Monday as well, and getting over something. So don't feel any great sense of obligation, and don't feel that you have to do something. You might want to do something. You might feel that there's an obligation to make an impact, an obligation to be dramatic. Yeah, sure, you can be dramatic if you want, but is it really such a good idea? And maybe the answer is no, it's not. And maybe you should just do things your way, and perhaps think about your everyday routines, and are your everyday routines working out? Are they sufficient? And that brings me on to the issue of Uranus. Uranus has been in Taurus for quite a long time, and now it's changing sign, and Uranus is in Gemini. And Uranus's sign change will affect everyone at some level. And so with Uranus moving into Gemini, it might be a time to be thinking about the way you structure your life. You've perhaps decided on a particular structure because it felt convenient, or it was too much of a bother to change. But now that Uranus is moving into Gemini, and yes, remember, it stays in Gemini till 2032. Okay, it does temporarily leave Gemini, move into Taurus between November and April, but then end of April, about April 25th, 26th, it moves in. It goes back into Gemini, and it will stay in Gemini, until 2032. So right now you should assume that Uranus has made a lasting and final change, and ask yourself, what are you going to do about it? And what does it mean? And it just may be that some of the ways in which you have been organizing your life perhaps need to change. You've perhaps got too used to certain routines. Maybe you've got too used to the kind of things you do every day, every week, all the time, and it's just become part of your life, and it sometimes feels as if it's just going to go on forever. until the very end. But no routine is so fixed, so important that it needs to last forever. And some routines might well need to be overthrown and need to be replaced with something else. Things change, you change, circumstances change, your needs change. And what worked for the last 7 years isn't necessarily going to work for the next 7 years. And so, be ready to make changes. And of course, there's going to be pressure on you to stick to what you've been doing, because it's easier for everyone, and people hate change. You hate change. But I think at the same time, that change is necessary. And, over the next year, or so, as Uranus makes this transition, it's not an entirely smooth transition, Uranus moving from Taurus to Gemini, because Uranus moves into Gemini, then November it moves back into Taurus, and then it finally, on April the 25th, 26th of next year, makes the movement into Gemini, and then it stays there until 2032. So all of the routines, or many of the routines which you've taken for granted, which you just feel are just part of your life, they perhaps need to be reconsidered. And this might have relevance for your health, mental and psychological. What you eat every day, what kind of exercise you have. It shouldn't just be necessarily just a permanent part of your life. Or perhaps there's a new routine which you haven't thought of, which needs to be brought in, and so that is something that you might want to consider. Now, Uranus moving into Gemini can say something about animals. In the Capricorn chart, Gemini relates to small animals, smaller than a goat, so that it sort of includes cats, dogs, rabbits. Not whales, not horses, because horses are not ruled by the 6th house. They're ruled by the 12th house in traditional astrology. But do think about the role of animals in your life. So, for example, if you decided to get a pet over the next year while Uranus is in Gemini, you might think that that's just a casual thing to do. It's something to do. I think in America, I think something like 40% of Americans have dogs. That seems rather a lot. But with Uranus in Gemini, pets, dogs, cats, they can cause absolute chaos, and they can cause major change, for better or for worse. So that is an example of completely changing your routine. I know that sounds a bit sort of off the wall, but that is just what could happen. That is a possible manifestation. So if you don't have a dog and you're planning on getting a dog over the next year, I would say think about it very carefully. Think about the kind of changes it would bring, and routines in general, the way you organize your life. It's not necessarily going to stay the same, and you might decide as a conscious decision that you're the one that's going to create the change, and if you make the right change, I think that you're going to be happier and healthier. So I would regard Uranus moving into Gemini as a challenge, but I think a challenge that can in the end work in your favor. Aquarius, there is a view that I disagree with, that Uranus is ruler of Aquarius. Now, as I said, I do not believe that. Rulership is something that is quite historical. There is a tradition about rulerships, and it's certainly in Western astrology there is an elaborate system of essential dignities, and Uranus has no part of that system of essential dignities, and so Uranus doesn't rule Aquarius in my view. I will accept though that Uranus has an association with Aquarius, and so Uranus moving into Gemini, out of Taurus into Gemini, you might say, well, it has it's likely to have a big impact on you. Not because Uranus rules Gemini, not because Uranus rules Aquarius, not because you have a special connection with the planet Uranus, but every sign change does matter, and every sign change of Uranus does matter. And as far as how you should perceive Uranus moving into Gemini, I think you should regard it as a good thing. Regardless of what your views about Aquarius's ruler is, even if, well, as I believe, Uranus doesn't rule Aquarius, it's still significant that Uranus is moving into Gemini, and Uranus moving into Gemini, is about what is about you. It's about what you can do to be really original. I mean, Uranus is a very original planet, and Aquarius is quite an original sign. Aquarians like to believe themselves to be original. And if you want to be original and you want to be different, of course, you've got to be able to go with the flow, and you've got to change with the times. There is a difference between being original and sort of cranky and idiosyncratic. Some people just hold on to things, and they may be different from everyone else, but just because you're different from someone else doesn't necessarily mean that your originality is appreciated. It might just be seen as, weird and cranky. So you've got to kind of make the distinction. And if you want to be genuinely original, then you are going to have to change, and you're going to have to change as the collective changes. And perhaps your role now is to bring down to earth a change which is taking place in the collective, which is symbolized by Uranus moving into Gemini. So what is it that you actually have to offer? What can you do that is different? Now, so if you're talking about originality, it's not something vague and unconnected, some random idea that comes your way. It's about something you have been developing. And you might want to look back at the last 7 years, while Uranus was moving through Taurus, what was going on? And there may have been things that you were keeping to yourself, that you were working on, but you weren't being very open about it. And perhaps also with Uranus in Taurus, you were deciding, what you were all about and what it meant to be you. And now you understand that, you can move things to the next level. And so, do think about how you're different, and also think about what you enjoy. Uranus in Gemini is about enjoyment, and it's about doing something that is special, that only you can do, and not being afraid about it, certainly not being ashamed about it. And it's not a time for compromise. You're just doing things because that's what people want. Because what people want is very temporary, it's short term, and it's different from the unconscious processes represented by the collective, which I think that now you are able to tune into. And aside from Uranus moving into Gemini, what is Monday going to be like? Moon's in Sagittarius. It's making a trine to Mercury. I think that moon trine Mercury looks pretty good as far as relationships are concerned. Getting on with people, friends, partners, being able to say the right thing, having just a general ease to you. I think you are at the moment probably a fairly easy person to get on with, provided you don't take anything too seriously. Because the moon makes a trine to Mercury, but it also makes a square to Mars. So moon square Mars, it could be that you run into something that you don't like the sound of, and you feel you have to make a special effort to make a fuss, but don't go down that road. just keep it simple, keep it easy, Aquarius, and then I think that you can have a reasonable day, and I think that things are working, things look pretty smooth. And yeah, do think about Uranus and Gemini, and think about what your unique contribution is, and how you really can be original. And it's not about being original just for the sake of it. Originality has origins, it has roots. And so think about how you've been developing over the last 7 years and what that means for the future. Pisces, you're ready to go. You're ready to take action. You want to be seen, you want to be heard, you know that you've got lots to offer, and you're not chaotic or ill-disciplined about it either. Because you know what needs to be done, and if something hasn't been done properly, you'll know about it straight away. And so Pisces, don't be afraid to be ambitious, and also think about what you're able to do, because there's actually a lot you can do, and you just have the edge. Where it counts, you can do things better than other people, and that will be noticed. And okay, not everyone will appreciate it. There may be some jealousy, but don't worry about it. And you really can make an impact. Yeah, it's quite possible with Moon square Mars that someone creates trouble, tries to create trouble, tries to hold things back, tries to sort of make complaints which really have no merit whatsoever. So be confident, hold on to what is important, and do not allow yourself to be distracted. And it's not that you're serious, so it's not that you're a heavy person. You're able to be pleasant, but also you are very determined, and I think that this determination is really going to count. And additionally, Pisces, you can get people's attention, and you've got interesting things to say, interesting observations. And if you do feel that you're not being taken seriously, you just have to say the right thing, because some of the things you say could actually have a real impact. And if you want to spring a few surprises, Pisces, then that is very much something you can do. Now, one thing that is happening today that may not be of short-term relevance is Uranus is moving into Gemini. Now, Uranus moves into Gemini today. It will leave Gemini in November and go back into Taurus, but then at the end of April of next year, it will go into Gemini, and it will stay in Gemini until 2032. Now, this is important for you, Pisces, because Gemini it's a mutable sign. Pisces is a mutable sign. Gemini in your chart, represents the foundations of everything. And so with Uranus in Gemini, this might be a time where you have to question your foundations, and you might be thinking, for example, about where you live. Are you happy where you're living? Is this where you want to live indefinitely? Or maybe it's time to make a change. And that might be one way in which Uranus and Gemini could work. It could also, if you own land, if you own real estate, Uranus and Gemini could stir things up. Your attitude to land and property could change, and likewise, if you're renting, of course, if you're renting somewhere, you usually have more flexibility, and so with with Uranus in Gemini, and you feel you're not happy about where you're living, you might feel, well, it's time to move somewhere else. And so that is one way in which Uranus in Gemini could work. And what's really happening is that you are responding to what's going on in the collective. All of us are going to feel Uranus in Gemini, but different signs are going to feel it in different ways. And it could be with Uranus in Gemini that what happens is that you are making contrasts. The concept of division is very important to Uranus in Gemini, and I'll be talking about that later in this video. Division. What you have, what other people have, you and the other. What makes you different from another person? Making a comparison, for example, between, your comfort, another person's comfort, where you live, where someone else's live. You make those comparisons. You might not sound very healthy to make those comparisons, but it's the way Uranus and Gemini can work. And so when you make those comparisons, you may feel that some kind of change is required. And, you think that, something like security and grounding is sort of fixed and just there all the time and it's uncomplicated, but it's not. It does change, and what you thought represented security may have to change, and you may realize that it's not real security, and perhaps you'll be thinking about something else, some other possibility. And so Uranus and Gemini certainly could stir things up. It's not a bad thing. It's all about development, although short term it might feel a bit troubling, but I wouldn't worry about it. And don't forget, Uranus is a transpersonal planet. Its influence is collective, and you may not feel it in a personal sense. So those are my forecasts for the 12 signs. And as you can see, I put great emphasis on Uranus being in Gemini, although we may not feel Uranus moving into Gemini straight away. And what I want to do now is look at things from a viewpoint of the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is Monday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 49, revolution. And that is really a very appropriate hexagram to have on this day in which Uranus moves into Gemini. And Uranus is, of course, the planet of revolution. And so Uranus changing sign, revolution. Something's changing. Something might have to change. And with this hexagram, many of us are going to be feeling restless. We're going to feel that the old ways are no longer serving their purpose and that we have to move on to something else. And of course, if we want to move on to something else, there is the idea we have to destroy something. Although we have to remember that the I Ching is a Confucian oracle. It's all about the order of things. And so you could say from a Confucian point of view that revolution is actually necessary to maintain the order, because when things get stagnant, when people in power just get used to being in power, they get complacent, they maybe get corrupt, then in order for the system to continue, it needs to evolve, and people have to be overthrown as a way of creating permanence. So there is a sort of contradiction there between revolution, at least in a Confucian sense. So as far as our own revolution is concerned, many of us may feel that it is time for a change. We're ready for a change, and we want to get going on this change as soon as possible. Now, if we look at this hexagram, we have top three lines, we have the lake, and the bottom three lines represents the fire. And so the fire under the lake. So the lake, we might see this tranquil lake, but underneath there's something brewing. And that's perhaps what revolution is about. Now, in terms of this hexagram, those three lines at the bottom, they all move. So we've got three moving lines, the bottom three lines all move. And so that's quite powerful. We are really ready. But then, okay, so the bottom line moves. What does that mean? The bottom line is the beginning of a matter. And the beginning of a matter suggests that we don't want to move too quickly. We want to change the world, we want to change something, but if we act too quickly without enough thought, well, we're not going to get anywhere. That's not necessarily a good way to start a revolution. And, then we move to the second line. So restraint starts to ease, and we can start slowly preparing for the big change. And again, we've got to be very responsible about it. Then, third line. Third line in I Ching, often difficult. This third line is difficult. And again, we want a revolution, and we want to push forward. We want to put change into practice, and we go for it. And if we go for it, it may not work. It's just too much, and we're trying to make that transition from the bottom trigram to the top trigram to real action, so that that lake gets turned into a storm. We want to make that transition, but it's hard work, and there may be a lot of resistance. So when is the right time? And the I Ching talks about 3 rounds of conversation, talking about things 3 times. So if you're thinking about revolution, you need to think about it or talk about it, 3 times. The first time you talk about it, it's just sort of vague ideas. It's just an idea, and it gets dismissed. You talk about it a second time, it's more serious. You have more of an impact, but still, you haven't got what it takes. You do have a few ideas, though, about how you might want to put that revolution into practice, but still the time isn't right, and people don't take it too seriously. But when you talk about it a third time, something's happened. Or maybe it's not us talking about it, it's when we observe other people. We observe them talking about revolution the first time and the second time. But then the third time, something's happening, something needs to change. And that is when the movement happens. But we must get that movement right, and we must be ready for it. And then we get real movement. We get the hexagram 47, which we move to. So that's when the revolution actually perhaps happens. And what is the result of that revolution? It's like a huge burden. If you've read the description of Fidel Castro's revolution in the late 1950s, when Fidel Castro got to Cuba on his boat, and it was just a complete disaster, and they were waterlogged, and I think there were about a dozen of them. They landed in Cuba, and they were soaked to the skin, and they didn't have any. They didn't have any. They had a few guns, but it wasn't serious. This was no way. But they just kept going. They just kept going, and they didn't stop. And somehow they turned it round. And in the end, from this bedraggled beginning, they managed to take over a whole country. And so with oppression, it's not a good start. So we have our revolution, and how do we feel? Not great. We feel that it's all down to us, and oppression is just, we've got a big weight on our shoulders, and we're having to carry the revolution. Perhaps no one else is interested in our revolution, but now we've started it. Well, what do? Well, we just have to keep going, and it's really hard work, but there is a promise here. I think the promise, there are no guarantees here, but if we get it right, if we're able to move forward, however difficult it might be, it seems that we can get a result. And in the end, we can enact the revolution. But revolutions are not easy, and they may not even be glamorous. They can be just really hard work. And so if you want to be a revolutionary, just make sure that you're able to put in the work. And now it's time to look at Uranus moving into Gemini. And so the question is, what does it all mean? And so let's just start off with the moment that Uranus moves into Gemini. Here it is, just to remind us. I make it that it happens today, Monday, July the 7th, 2025, in London. It's Westminster, London time. I make that 8:45 a.m. and there you can see Uranus is at 0 degrees 0 minutes Sagittarius. It's 0 degrees 0 minutes Gemini. And so just to remind you of the way it works is Uranus is slowing down now. Uranus starts into moving through Gemini, but then on September the 5th or the 6th, it goes retrograde. It goes retrograde at 1 degree 28 minutes Gemini. And then it goes back. And then on November the 7th or the 8th of this year, it moves back into Taurus. And so keeps going retrograde. And it finally goes stationary direct on February the 4th, 2026 at 27:28 Taurus. Then it goes forward, and then on, I think, April the 25th or 26th, it goes into Gemini again, and then it stays in Gemini until August the 3rd, 2032, when it moves into Cancer. And so what does this mean? What is Uranus about? Uranus, we are told, is the planet of revolution. And, some people get really quite excited about Uranus. They regard Uranus as, it's not just an exciting planet, it's an adventurous planet. It's about new inspirations. It's about the development of humanity. If you're one of those people that believe that Uranus is a ruler of Aquarius, and you also believe that Aquarius is a wonderful, happy sign, like in, the dawning of the age of Aquarius and all of that, you can be incredibly positive about this planet. And I am not convinced. So this raises the question of, what actually does Uranus mean? What is it about? Now, as far as I'm concerned, if you want to know what a planet is about, it might be a good idea to look at the positions of the planets when that planet started to come into human consciousness. And obviously, Uranus moved into human consciousness when it was discovered by William Herschel. And so here is the chart for the discovery of Uranus. March the 13th, 1781 at 10:30 p.m. in Bath, in England. And this was clearly sort of a big event. And of course, don't forget that Uranus, perhaps it's the nature of its planet, it went through lots of name changes. It used to be called Herschel. It also used to be called the Georgian planet, because, of course, George III was on the throne when Uranus was discovered. And I would have said, if you want to know what Uranus is about, it might be a good idea to actually look at the chart of its discovery. And for a start, Uranus was in Gemini when it was discovered. So, we think about Uranus having an association with Aquarius, but maybe there's a certain connection with Gemini and Uranus. So Uranus is actually moving into the sign it was in when it was discovered. Also, at the time of the discovery, Mars was opposition Uranus, and the Sun was, in fact, there was a Mars-Saturn opposition at the time of its discovery, opposition Uranus, and the Sun was making a square to Uranus. So this indicates to me, just looking at this chart, that Uranus is a planet of violence, of destruction. perhaps of death. It's a malefic. I think there's no doubt about that. Overall, Uranus should not be regarded as a fortunate planet. I mean, all things being equal, that means you can still have fortunate events with Uranus, but given the chart of its discovery, I think that there is something quite grim about Uranus. And yeah, it might be exciting, as in may you live in interesting times, the old Chinese curse, but that discovery chart does I think tell us a great deal. And so we should be seeing Uranus as it moves through the signs as perhaps telling us about how the principles of chaos, death, destruction, and change are actually manifesting. I mean, I know there are other ways of looking at it, and you might think you have to sort of look at the evidence, but I will be sort of looking at the evidence to some extent, and so there is then the question of what it means for Uranus to be moving through the signs, and okay, Uranus has just moved through Taurus. Well, what does that mean? I mean, it's kind of difficult to say. You can think of countries that are Taurian. You think of Taurian countries, countries that have a special association with Taurus. Have they changed? For example, Israel, I would associate with the sign Taurus. I'd also associate Ireland with Taurus. Obviously, Ireland is the Emerald Isle, and traditionally Ireland is associated with Taurus. Green Emerald Isle, and so. Ireland, I think, I've never been to Ireland, but Ireland has been certainly a country that's been under a lot of pressure recently. One of the reasons has been immigration, and as you've seen, there's been a lot of civil unrest in Ireland. With Israel, well, I don't have to say much about Israel, certainly since the attack on October the 7th, 2023, when Hamas invaded Israel. Obviously that happened when Uranus was in Taurus, and so that might be one manifestation of Uranus moving into Taurus. Now, as far as Gemini is concerned, what is Gemini about, and what might we expect with Uranus in Gemini? Well, thinking about it, some things we already know. Gemini is a planet of communication. There's no doubt about that. How we talk, how we communicate, and we already know over the last year. We've had, ChatGPT, for example. I don't know whether you've come across ChatGPT, but ChatGPT is, in my opinion, absolutely frightening. And what I think is frightening about ChatGPT is the way you can have a conversation with ChatGPT, and it totally transforms the concept of communication. Oh, but you might think, oh, it's not a human. It's not really a human. We know it's not a human. But the thing is that when you talk to real humans out there, usually the conversation is effectively computerized. Human computers, people have scripts for talking. People just talk. They have a certain set of responses, and it's fairly... Human conversation is actually pretty automated. And so, yeah, ChatGPT is also automated, but so is it with humans. You could say that, oh, but ChatGPT is just copying from what other people have said on the internet. But again, when you talk to humans, people do the same. So I'm not entirely convinced that most humans are so different from ChatGPT. But the point is, you can have this conversation with ChatGPT, and it feels like a genuine conversation sometimes. And ChatGPT can flatter you and make you feel good about yourself, and it's very intense. And this is only the beginning. Now there are some people are saying that actually AI has reached a certain limit, that it's just processing what we already know. But I think that in terms of how we communicate, that's certainly something that we're already seeing. That is one example. And with Gemini, you are also seeing the concept of splits, division. And I remember I've got my sun in Gemini, and so I think I can say this, that in some ways Gemini is a very toxic sign, and Gemini can be a toxic sign because it likes to see things in terms of them and us, me and you, how I am different from you. Divisions, they could be social divisions, how we are different from others. I can remember at the beginning of astrology, beginning of my studies of astrology, it was sort of in the sort of late 80s, and I was listening to someone, and they were talking about the association between South Africa and Gemini. Of course, that was at the time when apartheid was still in existence in South Africa, and that there is something, unfortunately, very Gemini in terms of apartheid, because apartheid is about separate development. This race is different from another race, and it may not be about race, but it's just about how people are different and the intensification of differences. And so I'm thinking that with Uranus moving into Gemini, there is a real possibility that differences can really be intensified. And I will be giving some examples in a moment. And so I'm thinking that it could be a time when the differences between people over the next 7 years are really going to be intensified, and not just the difference between people and sort of countries, nations, and it's not a time where people are necessarily going to be at ease with each other, and it may then feel that the only way to resolve these kind of problems is with violence. And so going back to the chart of Uranus's discovery, Uranus is in Gemini, opposition at the time of its discovery, Mars-Saturn conjunction in Sagittarius, and square the sun in square the sun in Pisces. So as far as generally speaking, what parts of the world might be affected by Sun moving into Gemini, Uranus moving into Gemini? I mean, one place that really gets me, but I can't help but think about is London. I think London is going to be really, really affected by Uranus moving into Gemini, and London is a Gemini city. I don't have a chart for London showing it's a Gemini city. It has traditionally been a Gemini city. Certainly, William Lilly in the 17th century was talking about it as a Gemini city, mentioned it as being under Gemini, and I think it really is. And you have to think that in London's recent history, not Sadiq Khan, but the two previous mayors, Boris Johnson and Ken Livingstone, were both Geminis. And of course, Ken Livingstone was head of the GLC in the 80s, the Greater London Council, before Margaret Thatcher abolished it. And he was a Gemini, and so those two really sort of, they do link with with that Gemini connection and London. And so with Uranus moving through Gemini, and London is going to really be a very difficult place. I think that everything will change in London, and one wonders, the next mayoral election is Sadiq Khan or whoever his successor is. How well is that going to go? And you've got divisions in London. Of course, London is it's got incredible social divisions. It's got incredible wealth. There's also going to be poverty, and then of course you've got ethnic divisions and religious divisions. And so London could really be in the firing line of Uranus moving into Gemini. Now, one country that we always think about when we think about Uranus in Gemini, or at least we have recently, is the United States. And the United States was born when Uranus was in Gemini. You'll see that Uranus was discovered in the middle of a Revolutionary War on March 13th, 1781. So Uranus came into consciousness at the same time as Uranus came into being. As the United States came into being. So here is the chart of the United States, and of course there's Uranus at 8 degrees 55 Gemini. And by the way, my sun is at 8 degrees 13 Gemini. What impact does the United States have on me? That's a question, but anyway, you're not interested in me. This is the United States, so it perhaps describes what Gemini is about. Uranus and Gemini, it's about a war. It was fighting a war, obviously, against the British, and clearly wars are about divisions. People wanted their independence. It was no longer enough for the colonists to be part of the British Empire. They saw it about, them, colonists, and the British, the colonial power, and wanting a separation. And separation is a feature of Uranus in Gemini, separating things. You can't really regard things as being together. I think I remember reading this book. I don't know what this book was about. It was, I think it was in the early 80s, and I don't think I even finished the book. But this theory was some occult book based, and it was saying that it was some absolute occult disaster from a spiritual reason. It was an absolute disaster that Britain and America split, but it was not just a national. It wasn't talking about a national disaster for Britain, but it was some kind of spiritual disaster. I'm not advocating that point, by the way, but I just thought I'd point that out. And anyway, so it is about a split, and so you might say that this says something about the beginning of America, and this is what it was born under. And we know that a Uranus cycle later, there was a civil war. And so here, of course, is the start of the civil war with Uranus in Gemini. And again, talking about split and division, this is the theme, the North and the South, the Union, the Confederacy. There is a split. The Confederacy wants to go their separate way. They disagree about something. And it's interesting, going back to that theme, what I was mentioning about South Africa, that South Africa, talking about an apartheid and Gemini, and of course this one of the main reason for the Civil War was slavery. But some people could be enslaved and some people could be free, and there was a racial basis for this. So there is a split there. And so it's almost as well that, the United States is very sensitive potentially to that Uranus and Gemini energy. And yes, it does relate to splits. And that's really what Uranus in Gemini is perhaps about. And perhaps this Uranus and Gemini cycle is starting to get reinforced. So we're thinking, well, every time Uranus moves into Gemini, something happens in the United States. It finds itself perhaps at war. Now, a Uranus cycle later, almost, if we go for Pearl Harbor. So the Pearl Harbor attack, which is, I've got Pearl Harbor somewhere here. There we go. So there's Pearl Harbor. Uranus was not in Gemini at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack. Uranus was at 27 degrees 39 Taurus. And in fact, Uranus will be going stationary February the 4th next year at 27-28 Taurus, very, very, very close to where Uranus was at the time of Pearl Harbor. But Uranus did go stationary, did go stationary direct, and certainly by the next year, 1942, when the United States was really involved with the Second World War, Uranus was in Gemini. So I think we can say now that Uranus in Gemini really does indicate indicate war for America, and it's not just about splits. Well, it is about splits and division, but a division that can only be resolved through war. I mean, you could say that with the Declaration of Independence. It's not enough to make the Declaration of Independence. You have this theoretical split, but then it can only be resolved through military conflict. Likewise with the Civil War, you can't just say, oh well, the southern states, they have slavery, we don't have slavery, and that's a difference. No, you've got to go to war about it. I'm not saying they shouldn't have gone to war about it, but that might be how you think about it. And then, likewise, Uranus and Gemini, it's not enough to have a division between the United States and Nazi Germany and Japan. You have to have a war about it. Well, in this case, the United States didn't start the war. It was the Japanese that attacked Pearl Harbor, and of course, as far as the Germans were concerned, it was Hitler that declared war on Germany. It wasn't the other way around. And Uranus was in Gemini for some time, and when we look at war, certainly with relation to the previous war, the Civil War. Now, the Civil War represented war at a new level. And I think it has been argued that the Civil War was the first war that was really an industrial war. And this was perhaps reflected in the casualties. When you've got an industrial war, it was the beginnings of an industrial war. And of course, we saw a real industrial war by the time of the First World War. But it was like how war develops. And so the Second World War was about a new way of perhaps fighting war and the development of new weapons. And the culmination of the Second World War was, of course, the bombing of Hiroshima. And so, here is the chart of Hiroshima. And so here is, remember, Uranus rules uranium. And it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that uranium is now kind of being talked about again, because we're talking about Iran and its enriched uranium. I'll be talking about that in a moment, but in detail when I look at next thing. But so the bomb, the Hiroshima bomb, was not a plutonium bomb; it was a uranium bomb, and Uranus rules Uranus. Sorry, uranium rules Uranus, and of course this was a time when you had America trying to create a bomb, and the culmination of it was Uranus on the midheaven. Uranus in Gemini on the midheaven was when the bomb was dropped. And this is, I mean, I know it's a horrible chart, but it's a wonderful chart. It's a chart to me that really demonstrates that astrology works. It just that plane, right? With the Uranus right above Hiroshima, Uranus right there, the airburst. It didn't blow up on the ground. It blew up sort of thousands of feet above Hiroshima, and it just fits so horrifically and wonderfully well. And if you go through the 40s, okay, but Uranus was actually only at 16 Gemini, and there was another event which took place the next year, and the next year was Winston Churchill's speech at Fulton, Missouri, where Winston Churchill made his Iron Curtain speech, and so you had the beginnings of the Cold War, and you had the communists starting to take over countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, really starting to assert themselves. So Winston Churchill made this speech in which he said something like, "An iron curtain has descended upon Europe from Stettin to Trieste." Of course, Stettin is on the Baltic, and Trieste was on the Italian sort of Yugoslav border as it was then. And so, Iron Curtain, that's such a Uranus and Gemini concept, split and division. And so I think we're really starting to get a feel for what that means for Uranus to be in Gemini. And so I think that this is giving us clues. And so looking forward to the next time Uranus moves into Gemini, we might predict that the United States is going to be at war. I mean, that would be logical. But we have to be careful about making that prediction, because you could say it's overfitted, to use a statistical term. So, for example, if you take a couple of charts and you think these charts have got something in common, and you think these people have astrology throws up a huge number of factors. A lot of factors, aspects, planets in signs, planet in houses, and whatever. And you're always going to find some connection after the event you're always going to find some common astrological feature between any chart. It's always going to happen, and it will happen randomly. And of course, this is one reason why you should have as few factors as possible. This is one of the main reasons I don't like to use asteroids in my astrology, because I don't like to overload things. But it just may be an overfitted thing, and it could, we've focused on Uranus and Gemini, but to say that these connections between America going at war, but maybe there's something else we could have been focusing on. But symbolism does fit. And, the descendant, it is the United States' descendant. Descendant is about enemies, the Gemini descendant in America. So there is a kind of a fit there, and so I do maintain that there is a real possibility that that the United States does find it itself. Although you could then argue, well, why wasn't Uranus in Gemini in 1812? I mean, 1812. The United States was at war with Britain. It was a serious war. The United States, it was a draw. I mean, it depends who you listen to about who won that war. But neither side actually won. There was a danger at one stage in the 1812 war, I believe, that parts of New England might have split off and wanted to become part of Canada, not for military reasons. I think some people in New England actually wanted to be part of Canada at the time, but it was serious. The White House got burnt down. I mean, that didn't happen in any other. It didn't happen in the Second World War. But still, Uranus was not in Gemini during the 1812 war, and still, the United States did find itself at war. So we should just be a little bit careful about this. But yeah, as I said, I still feel concerned about Uranus moving into Gemini, and so as far as America is concerned, I think that there are real possibilities that it finds itself one. And don't forget, Uranus has just gone into Gemini, and so we've got quite a few more years for the thing to run its course. And will we is America going to be at war now today because Uranus has gone into Gemini? No, there are going to be other times to consider. I mean, let's for example, you look at the United States' solar return for 2026 for next year. So that's when you have a Mars-Uranus conjunction in Gemini, and so that will be in the United States' sixth house, and so that looks like quite a scary solar return for the United States. Although I've set this for Philadelphia, but it won't be so different in Washington D.C. But it won't necessarily be on the angles, and then there are other events for next year. In fact, 2028. In 2028, there is a Mars-Uranus conjunction. This conjunction on June the 23rd, 2028, could be very serious, because this conjunction is at 1125 Gemini. So if you compare that chart with the United States' chart, so we put USA and there. This conjunction between Mars and Uranus at 2028 is right on America's descendant, and so this will be, the last year of Trump's regime. Probably America will be gearing up to elect Vance, assuming Trump is still president. But don't forget that the United States has a wide Mars-Uranus conjunction on the descendant. So this is a time of real pressure for the United States, 2028. So if nothing happens today when Uranus goes into Gemini, don't think that that's over. And look at Mercury. You've got Mercury, Mars, Uranus making that conjunction all together on June the 23rd, 2028. So that's those are a few thoughts about America. I think it is certainly something to be very concerned about. And going back to what Uranus and Gemini is all about, it is splits. It is about them and us, and it's not just about countries. It's about how countries feel about themselves, and the divisions in the United States, the divisions in the world, and the old certainties are going, and what is happening in the Middle East, what is happening in Ukraine, and the fact that you're going to get potentially new blocks. Remember Churchill's Fulton, Missouri speech. We could see new iron curtains across Europe, across other places. For example, when this war between Russia and Ukraine ends, where is the border going to be? We don't know at the moment. The longer it goes on, I suspect the further west that border is going to be. Though I don't believe for a moment that Russia has any intention of invading Europe, invading Poland, or even the Baltics, or even Western Ukraine. So I don't think that's going to happen. But we're going to see divisions. We're going to see a more divided world, and maybe a divided world in a very major kind of way. We could see sort of blocks, and so that's that is something that I would expect to see over the next few years. Simply, if you just follow history. And one other thing, a chart that I actually forgot to mention, which I did briefly want to mention, is the chart of the Battle of the Boyne. So the Battle of the Boyne was in 1690. It was July the 1st, using the Julian calendar, which was what Britain was on, but it was on July the 11th, using the Gregorian calendar. And the Battle of the Boyne actually happened pretty much on the day that Uranus moved into Gemini. And this happened. This happened. Obviously, this happened in Ireland, the Battle of the Boyne. And so, with the Battle of the Boyne, you had James II was a Catholic king in England, in the UK, in Britain, and he was regarded as being a tyrant, and so by Protestants and by a lot of the people that mattered. So they basically, Britain engineered a sort of a Dutch invasion, and the final battle of this thing called the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution actually happened when Uranus was in Taurus, but the actual culmination of the Glorious Revolution, the final act, when what happened with the Battle of Boyne, when Uranus was exactly in Taurus and it was exactly in Gemini. So in a sense, the tyrant had been defeated. And this kind of links in a strange way to the United States, because this concept of tyranny, George III, the tyrannical king, a lot of them, they actually got it from the Glorious Revolution. And in fact, if you look at some of the arguments that the Second Amendment advocates make, they don't just talk about the United States law. They actually talk about what was going on in England in the 1680s. And so this battle for the tyrant, this final victory over the tyrant, which happened in the UK, it kind of has weird echoes with the American Revolution. And so it was almost this Uranus moving into Gemini, or that moment Uranus moving into Gemini, was a kind of a sort of a forerunner of the American Revolution. So, that's just a thought. I mean, maybe I'm just reading too much into it. So, those are my thoughts pretty much so far on Uranus and Gemini. I think it's a serious event, and it's going to lead to a world which is going to be more divided, much more divided. We're going to see divisions which, by the time Uranus moves into Cancer, we will see divisions that are perhaps only starting to manifest, and divisions between countries, groups of countries, class divisions, financial divisions, who has, who doesn't have, and that's how people will see things. And we may actually also see some kind of new Iron Curtain. What that Iron Curtain represents, it's difficult to know, but it's additionally, you could say it's a kind of Uranus and Gemini. It's a kind of a Tower of Babel thing, and it's yes, I think it would to an extent be anti-global, the concept of globalization and people working in harmony and peace together. That's not what Uranus and Gemini is going to be about, I don't think. Not this time round. And okay, you could say Uranus and Gemini with Bretton Woods, you was creating a new structure, a new system in 1944 or 45. But this time round, you also have to look at what's happening in the world and where the world is developing, and what is Uranus and Gemini going to mean to the world. And I mean, it's not about people coming together, it's about people separating, and if people come together, it will very much be through force. So those are my thoughts about Uranus and Gemini. I hope you found this video of some interest. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.